For those of you who don't know, Jen was at Berkeley. She's now in Paris. She's going to talk and has written this book called The Revolution That Wasn't, How Digital Activism Favors Conservatives. She's not only a researcher, but she's also a video maker, which I think will interest a lot of you. And I'm sure you're going to wrap in other bio stuff as you talk, right?
Happy to.
So what we're going to do, the format is each of you is going to speak for 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up. So we won't pause after each speaker, so write down your questions and we'll just jump into a Q&A after that.
Yeah, so thank you so much for having me and hearing you talk about the activities that your students are doing. It makes me want to go back to school. Professors like you are one of the reasons why I think I am doing what I am. When I was an undergrad at Duke University, soon after that, I did start to do some documentary filmmaking. But what I wanted to start out today was, first off, does anyone recognize this photo? Very good. Actually, it's a series of images, right, from an Apple commercial, exactly. It was a Super Bowl commercial. And it begins with a group of people sitting there in grim gray clothes, listening to their fearless leader, giving them the ideas. They're giving them some kind of instructions that they're needing to follow without question, right? It's a symbol of gray authoritarianism. And in comes a woman dressed in this awesome 1980s era, those of us who are from that time period, workout gear, and she runs in, she swings her sledgehammer, and she smashes the screen, and up comes this image, right? So 1984 won't be like 1984, right, is what Apple is saying when they're launching for the first time, right? Desktop computers, which at the time, now of course we have mobile, but this was a very revolutionary idea. And in fact, that's what they were alluding to. We're going to smash the system. And of course, the 1984 reference is to George Orwell's book by the same name. And indeed, about 5 years later, symbols of what many perceived and experienced as authoritarianism were smashed, whether it was the Berlin Wall and other symbols of the Soviet era came down. And at the same time, many tech pundits were arguing that out of the ashes of these symbols of authoritarianism and bureaucracy arise digital technology, which will create a revolution. And of course, especially in this area, the revolution was largely around the economy. This is an image from Wired magazine quoting Thomas Paine from the American Revolution, that we have it in our power to begin the world over again, right? This idea that technology is going to completely disrupt. And then Time magazine names you the person of the year in 2006, right? So that year was important for really the launch of social media. We can kind of debate what social media is, and there were other ways previously to communicate with each other online, but that was the launch of Twitter, the year of Twitter's launch. Facebook became available to the general public, not just universities. YouTube became diffused worldwide. But it was also the year that I went back to graduate school. I had been a documentary filmmaker and had documented marginalized communities fighting for social justice on a lot of different fronts: the workplace, the environment, their communities, their land. And I had these pressing questions as I would tour with my films, that why was it that people like me were mediating people's voices, right? And all of a sudden, people were making this argument that, well, the internet can do that, rather than having filmmakers or the news media, that people can now directly communicate with each other, right? So that was a key part of the revolution. And then 5 years later, the Time magazine person of the year was the protester, right? So 2011, of course, was kind of the pinnacle of the so-called Arab Spring movements, Occupy Wall Street here in the US, the Indignados in Spain. And there was this constant discourse in the media and even among scholars that these are Twitter revolutions, these are Facebook revolutions, these revolutions wouldn't happen without the internet. And so it really was, though, the 5-year later election of Donald Trump that kind of put the dagger in the heart of digital utopianism for some, not for all, of course. Also, that was when Cambridge Analytica became more prevalent, and there was this, we went from this pendulum swing of utopianism, right, to this more dystopian era, which we're kind of in now with discourse around, Trump's toxic tweets, Putin's bots, Facebook's disinformation algorithms. But nonetheless, right, especially around digital activism, whether we think about scholarly takes or others, there's still that sense that digital technology for social movements, for grassroots social movements, have what I like to call the 3 Ps: pluralism, participation, and personalization. And there's a lot of scholarship that addresses that. And here's just some of it. You can, if you look at my book, I cite, hundreds of scholars who are making this general argument. So most of this research, though, it kind of made sense when these movements were emerging to focus on these high-profile, visible movements, right? These protests in the streets. But the problem is that it really tended to analyze these very visible movements of plugged-in users, groups on the left, and increasingly has begun online with the analysis, with capturing hashtags, which is something that I do and analyze, and it's super fun, and you can do it really quickly. But the problem is that these claims that digital technology has transformed social movements is that it does something that social scientists like to call selecting on the dependent variable, which basically means that if we say that social movements are transformed by digital technology, but we're only looking at social movements that have high levels in use of digital technology, we're missing a wider variety of the everyday labor, political, and social movement activities. So that's what I aim to do. I, at the time, was at UC Berkeley when I started this project and wanted to look at an issue, right? And then figure out all the groups that were organizing around this issue on a statewide level, right? Rather than just focusing on the international, national level. And it was too tough to find an issue that attracted the far right in the San Francisco Bay Area. So North Carolina was an ideal place to do this research because it really is a so-called purple state, right? Obama won it by a hair in 2008, lost it by a hair in 2012, Trump won it by a hair in 2016. And that also is reflected in the broader geography of social movements. So the issue is collective bargaining rights for public employees. So basically that issue is something that basically is public employees like, for example, firefighters or teachers in the state of North Carolina are not allowed to have a union contract. They can have a union, but not a union contract. So this is a very contentious issue and attracted groups on both the left and the right. And really it operated less like a pure traditional labor issue and more like a broader social movement issue because unions are so marginalized in the state. There were, let me just point out one more thing. So there were on the left, certainly labor unions, worker centers, but also civil rights groups, student groups, other progressive organizations. On the right were Tea Party groups, preppers, which are far right groups preparing for some kind of government or political economic collapse with guns and food, et cetera, but also more mainstream conservative groups. And this provided some variation to compare different levels of digital activism use. So I'm not going to go into detail about this digital activism score that I developed, but I basically wanted to go beyond just looking at Twitter or Facebook or website use or any other platform. The score captures a wide variety of uses and participation on these platforms. And contrary to most of the literature, I found that conservative reformist groups that were more bureaucratic and hierarchical, rather than this horizontalism that many talk about in the digital era, and middle to upper class groups had much higher levels of digital engagement, right? So basically what I found was that there's a strong digital activism gap, that the three factors of it are inequality, institutions, and ideology, and I'm happy in the Q&A to get into more details, but first inequality, that I put this picture up here because one woman, when I asked her, working class woman, about using Twitter, she said, I don't get up there, right? So this idea that it's beyond their reach, certainly I'm also a digital divides inequality scholar or divide scholar, so I was expecting some level of inequality, but the extent of it was pretty profound. Out of the over 60,000 tweets that I analyzed over the 34 groups I studied over the lifetime of their Twitter activity, one was from a working class group, which is statistically zero, right? And the mechanisms of this inequality were certainly organizational differences in resources, as well as individual constraints, as well as contextual factors. The other issue that I found was groups like this, Civitas, a think tank, conservative think tank in North Carolina, very high levels of digital engagement. They're very hierarchical. Again, we have this idea that digital activism is really about horizontalism. And I found that over time, that it was really groups that had someone or some people dedicated who had the expertise and had the focused time to really engage online and really keep the social and labor or political movement activity active, was really able to sustain this digital activism. And in effect, right, one of the arguments I make is this idea of digital bureaucracy being really important, as well as manufactured personalization, right? So this idea of personalization was one of the 3 Ps I talked about. Is supposed to be a hallmark of this era, but often it's very manufactured, right? And the last piece that really gets, kind of ties together the inequality institutions is the third I, which is ideology, right? So conservatives had an online edge, and the key pieces of this weren't just because of their conservative ideas per se, although how they chose to communicate those ideas were key. They tended to have very straightforward messages around freedom, which tended to work better online with these kind of quick, witty, performative posts that tend to go viral. But they also tended to have a network of institutions to support them. And conservatives tend to be more middle to upper class and also had individual resources as well. But there was a clear motivation. Again, I'm happy to talk about the conservative engagement in the Q&A, but just to, one of many quotes that come to mind is one conservative activist said, Paul Revere had a horse, we have the internet, right? There's this motivation to go out and tell the truth, capital T, right? That's how they viewed it, that the mainstream media wasn't really covering them accurately. They found it too liberal, and that for them, digital technology was an amazing tool to get that information out, and they were really digital evangelizing in many ways, whereas the left focused on organizing more broadly, and the internet wasn't necessarily the best tool, or isn't the best tool to organize all the time. It can be one, but not all. So I just want to leave the last image here. Some of you may recognize this Monty Python image, some of you may not. If you don't, go watch Monty Python. But it's from, the Holy Grail, right? So this idea that we're searching for one solution to this dystopian era, right? This disinformation era. And if we could just, tackle these evil villains like Mark Zuckerberg or Donald Trump or Vladimir Putin and kind of regulate Facebook enough, then we can get our internet back. But the reality is that there are always these structural differences, and we may see, and there's the possibility of using digital tools on both sides, on the left and the right, and with different social classes. But these constraints have in effect set up an unequal power balance. And so one piece that I really want to point out that I think is key, and I'll just end with this, is that oftentimes when we think about this idea of disinformation that, or think of conservative use of the internet, that it's top down, people are just duped, it's fake news, whereas the left version of digital activism, it's bottom up, participatory, whether it's Obama or AOC or Occupy. But I really want to trouble that here, because a lot of the online engagement that I observed, and I spent a lot of time in the field interviewing people, is that these are grassroots conservatives who have their own organizations on the ground in their own right. And that we really have to be mindful of that when we think about whose revolution it is and whose revolution it's not. So thank you very much.
We have too many conglomerates. We need to get rid of the middleman. The internet is going to make it possible to create startups, little companies, and we're going to be able to optimize our resources and basically rent out our apartments or our cars or get freelance jobs. And Steve Hill's going to talk about that. He's, as those of you in cultural industries know from Haley's presentation, he's a journalist, worked with the New America Foundation in Washington. Now I guess you're based in the Bay Area.
Yes.
And has written several different books. And this one that we're going to talk about, or he's going to talk about today, is called Raw Deal: How the Uber Economy and Runaway Capitalism Are Screwing American Workers. Also notice you have a couple paperback copies there. So thanks very much, Steve.
So, listening to Jen's talk, the theme that came to me is kind of the best of times and the worst of times. There's a lot of potential and opportunity with the technologies, these digital technologies, but increasingly we're finding out that there's a lot of downsides to them. And a lot of times the downsides can be attributed to just powerful, wealthy forces that are learning to use the same technologies that the grassroots used, but they're using it for the same reasons they've always used it in big capitalist countries, which is just to make a lot of money. And increasingly with things like social media, what it turns out is that we are the product that they're selling. And so we have to really figure it out. And this is important for you to think about, because you're going to be the leaders. This is going to be these themes are going to go on for the next 15, 20 years. And so you, are, as the new leaders coming up, are going to have to make some really crucial decisions about how these technologies are going to work. And so I'm just going to outline a few things about it. And also, I understand that there's some of you who are interested in knowing, how do I make my way? How do I make a living, either as a journalist or as a videographer and what have you? And I'm happy to talk about that too, if that's of interest. So, there was a lot of euphoria. When my book, Raw Deal, came out in late 2015, newspapers like the New York Times and other leaders said, "Oh, Steve, you're being too negative. What do you mean? This is all good. This is the new way. Uber's, you're going to be able to hit your app and the car shows up. We're going to all be able to get rid of our cars. It's going to be good for the environment. It's going to be good for climate change. The work that we get as contractors, you're going to be able to go on your smartphone and you're going to be able to hit an app like an Upwork or a lot of the other online labor platforms." And the work is going to come to you. You'll be able to pick and choose what you want. This is basically, literally what they were selling us. And, initially they were definitely people like myself who were skeptical and like, it's never worked this way before. Why would new technology change this? And of course it hasn't turned out that way. But there are some opportunities. We just have to put the right rules around these companies to make sure that we can keep the good that's there and minimize the bad. So for example, since I'm sure you all are familiar with Uber and Lyft, what it turned out was that if you flood the streets with cars, which is what Uber and Lyft did. For example, in San Francisco, there's 1,800 traditional taxi cabs, right? And there are about 9,000 Uber and Lyft cars. So if you flood the streets with cars, especially in a city as dense as San Francisco, where it's already kind of congested, what do you think happens? Wow, it gets really congested. Traffic increases. So now you touch the app, the car shows up quickly, but you're waiting in traffic for 20 minutes. So what have you really gained, right? It also turns out that Uber and Lyft subsidize the ride. So when you get in that car, you're only paying about 50% of the cost of that ride. They're paying the other half because they're trying to keep their price low to beat the competition. Well, who's the competition? The competition also happens to be public transportation, which admittedly in San Francisco is not very good. If you've lived in Berlin, I've lived in Berlin, Jen's lived in Paris, it's one of the puzzling things about Americans is that we don't know what we don't know. So if you've never experienced what a real public transportation system looks like and how it works, you don't know even how good it could be. When I was in Berlin, I would walk out my door, there would be some sort of form of public transportation from 1 minute to 7 minutes away, and I didn't need to know the schedule because you just show up and something comes every 3, 4, 5 minutes, and you just get on and boom, you get to where you need to go, and you don't have to drive, you don't have to park. That's how it's supposed to work. Well, it doesn't work that way in San Francisco, never really has, and now that we have all these Uber and Lyft cars that are more and more blocking traffic, it's gotten even worse. Well, anyway, because they're subsidizing your ridership on public transportation, on Muni, is down. Ridership in New York City is down. Washington, D.C., down. Every major city, ridership on public transportation in a time when we're supposed to be getting people out of their cars is going down because Uber and Lyft are subsidizing your ride. And of course, if I've asked many people, well, how much did it cost you to take that Lyft? Well, it cost me about $7. And I said, well, what if instead it cost you $14? Would you have taken it, or would you found use public transportation? Oh, I wouldn't have taken it. That's too much. So basically, because they're subsidizing the rides by flooding the streets with cars, public transportation is down, congestion has gone up. There's been all sorts of studies of this thing at this point, where, for example, there's a study in New York City called Empty Seats, Full Streets. The empty seats part is referring to 40% of the time, those drivers are driving around with no passenger because there's so many of them that there's not enough work for all of them. So as a result, it's impacting labor. So we've got environment, congestion, labor, public transportation. All these things are being negatively impacted by Uber and Lyft. Now, I get that it's convenient, and when your public transportation system isn't very good, it's not surprising that people were looking for an alternative. But again, we have to look at the big picture on all these things. There's no question that San Francisco, just like with regular taxis, they limit the number of taxis for all these reasons. There needs to be a limit on these cars, but Jerry Brown, the governor of California a few years ago, in his infinite wisdom, passed a law at the state level saying a city like San Francisco cannot put a limit on the number of Uber and Lyft cars. So we're in this very strange situation now where you have one set of rules for traditional taxi, another set of rules for Uber and Lyft. That's just one example. Another example is a company called Upwork. How many people have heard of Upwork? If you've read my book, you saw it in chapter 4. So Upwork is a company where, you as a videographer, or as a translator, as a journalist, as a lawyer, architect, there's a huge number of occupations on this platform. And so, I can go on there and I can hire one of you as a videographer, or I could hire a videographer from Thailand or Philippines or India. And, they are very skilled there. They have access to technology. They can finish the job and upload it on using Dropbox or some other means, and I can hire them instead of hiring you. And as you look on Upwork on the platform, you can see someone like yourself is on that platform saying, oh, I'd like to make $40 an hour, $50 an hour for this job. Someone from Thailand is saying, I'll take $2 an hour. And so basically, it's a race to the bottom in terms of wages. And now, the flip side of it is that if we could put the right rules around a platform like Upwork, it actually could be a cool thing because, people in Thailand do need work, and people in India need work, and people in the rural area, maybe in Fresno or Merced, who can't be in San Francisco, they need work. And so it would be kind of cool if people could actually access work from wherever they are, as long as it doesn't turn into this race to the bottom in terms of wages and working conditions. I mean, a huge number of freelancers never get paid. You complete the job, you upload it on Dropbox, and they don't pay you. So and there's a whole bunch of things we can be doing to minimize this kind of thing. Again, it's like the best of times, worst of times. We've created this technology that makes it possible for you to make a living But it may not be a very good living because you're competing against people all over the world. I mean, it used to be to outsource, you had to move the factory to India. You had to move, your operations, physical plant to another country, and that was a disincentive. It's a lot of expense to do that. Now, to outsource, you can just go online, and you can just hire people from wherever they are, and maybe not even pay them. So, the other thing I'll just talk about briefly is, Mike, was that 5 minutes? Okay. So I'm currently, I actually have a position with an organization called the Center for Humane Technology. I'm a policy director there. And so, we're looking a lot at social media and really what it is. And, again, this is another example where it looked like it was really cool initially, as Jen was alluding to, but the person who co-founded this organization used to work for Google. He was a design ethicist. And, when you open up that smartphone, everything on there has been specifically designed to get a certain reaction out of you. They've studied psychological principles and methodologies to know, like, for example, a red button is going to get you to press more than a blue button. Auto-scrolling and autoplay, where, on YouTube, the videos just keep playing. The recommendation system, the likes, the follows, and all these such things. When you hit like and you hit follow, they are keeping track of you. They know what you like. They know every app on your phone is tracking you. They know they know when you're at the University of San Francisco. They know when you're at home. They know when you're at your doctor's office. They know everything about you. They know more about you than you know about you. And they are using this information in certain ways. What they do is, their goal as companies is to keep you on their app, on their website, their platform, as long as possible. Because as long as you're on there, they keep showing you ads. And every ad they show you, they make a ton of money. Facebook has almost 3 billion users around the world. It brings in about $71 billion a year, compared to, say, MSNBC. Or any of the other online, Fox News, who bring in less than $2 billion. So Facebook is enormous. Google, YouTube is enormous in terms of what used to be traditional media, and it's all through this model, this revenue model of where they are using all these carefully designed techniques to persuade you, to manipulate you, to keep you on their app, so they can keep showing you ads. Okay, that's kind of insidious enough. But the other thing is that they sell access to you. So they're selling you to the advertisers, but they're also selling you to political actors. They don't care who buys their service. They'll sell it to anybody. And so you have political actors that are trying to send you information. And of course, they want you to click, because when you click, they make money. So the information they put on there is information that's sensationalist. It's got a headline that they know about you, remember. They know if you don't like Trump or you don't like Trump. So they'll send you a headline that says Trump is the worst thing ever, Trump is the best thing ever, because oh, I'll click on that. And the more you click, the more they get to know you, the more extreme the information becomes. And so this is leading to what we call crazy town, where basically everybody is receiving online their own little Truman Show, maybe that's a reference you don't know, their own little filter bubble of who you are and who you hang out with, and keep you in this little information ghetto in a way that we're not talking to each other anymore. So this is really quite dangerous in a democracy. And then when you start adding in fake news where they know something about you and they make up stuff, and they're going to keep making up stuff in this presidential election, that also becomes a big problem, because and when you start adding in things like deep fakes, which I'm sure you've heard about as videographers, you know that at a certain point it will be hard for people to know what's true and what isn't. This is where the trajectory is heading. So the thing we're trying to do about that is we're going to regulate these companies in a new way. They're going to be regulated as utilities. And as utilities, they're going to have a lot more rules around them. They're going to have impact assessments about everything they do to their platforms, the recommendation system, the amplification system, the behavioral nudges they build into their system. All those things at a certain point are going to be regulated. So that's going to be an interesting time, because that's where you are going to have to plug into this new system that it's going to take a few years to put into place. But there's going to be a lot of need for people to be able to work in this new way that is going to be coming to us. So I guess I'm out of time, and we can talk more about how do you find work in this The other thing that I did in Raw Deal, there's a list of things that we have to have there. And one of there is what we call portable safety nets. So as an independent contractor, you'll be able to work for a range of businesses and employers, and each one of them will contribute a certain amount into an account that's set up for you where you can buy your health care and your sick leave and your unemployment and your paid time off and these kind of things. So we have to change how we do these things to accommodate the new economy, but it's going to take some time to do that because government is catching up to what the Silicon Valley, their motto is move fast and break things, right? So they've broken a lot of things. And it's going to take some time for us to put it back together in the right way moving forward. But those efforts are ongoing, and I'd love to talk more about them to you. Thank you.
Steve as well against the capitalist model of the mandate, right? Steve is talking about the public service model, which we've talked about in terms of, we talked a little bit about Zuckerman from MIT, talking about having public, Steve Zeltzer probably models what we've talked a little bit about, which is the community-based or social justice movement model. Steve and Kazmi Tori are not only married partners, but also activist partners. And for many years, we shared doing Laborfest, Labor Tech at USF. Labor Tech was a conference of grassroots union people who talked about how to use these technologies for advancing the interests of working people. So I've known them for a while. They also do Laborfest, which is an amazing event every summer, which is the idea that working people not only need to know how to use the internet, but already do some incredible creative work. So it provides a platform for poets and writers and videographers and musicians. And we showed a clip from Jack Chew the other day.
Oh, great.
International.
So a common thread, it sounded like, between everyone was the solution of regulation. My question is, what weight does regulation hold if each country has a different way about going about that and these technologies are so global? How can regulation be a solution if it's not standardized?
So who wants to start?
Well, okay, well, there's this thing called Internet Global Forum, IGF. And 2 years ago, it's an largest international computer conference of government, United Nations conference, civil society, corporations, and governments. So one that I was in 1918 in Paris, Macron was there. And the main thing that he said is that there's a struggle between Europe against Silicon Valley and China.
Just to remind everybody, Macron is the president of
France. So that was his struggle. But France and Europe has regulated, to some degree, information and spying on people. So you have to get permission before people can look at what you're doing. And that is one form of regulation. But the reality, in my view, is that's not going to stop these companies from really spying on people, frankly. There are ways that they will find out how to do it. But in Europe, it is more regulated. So, Steve?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add to that a little bit. I mean, if you look at what's going on right now, you see that we're kind of learning from each other. So Europe passed what they call the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR. Now California has passed its version of it. It's not as good, it's not as strong. And right now there's dozens of countries that have passed laws having to do with privacy and data. Some of them kind of drawing from the GDPR, others doing their own version of it. So you do see, different regulatory responses going on in different places, some of them faster than others. Here in the US, we're actually kind of one of the slowest. I mean, really a lot of the academic institutions are, in my view, are really just behind the ball on this. I mean, the leading leader on regulation is felt by the name of Alistair McTaggart, who's a businessman and spent millions of his own dollars to pass this version of the GDPR here in California. Whereas all the think tanks and others who just keep debating these things endlessly, never come up with any solutions that are actionable, are still just, out to lunch as far as I can tell. So other people are starting to step in. Governments in the U.S. state of Illinois just passed something having to do with using artificial intelligence for job interviews, using facial recognition for job interviews. So here in San Francisco, we passed a law forbidding the use of facial recognition at the city level. So, you know, we're all in this sort of phase where we're sort of testing things out, learning from each other, and it's going to take a number of years to figure this out.
And just to add that, one of the other things that we talked about last week was that Europe has taxed and pushed back on taxes for Google and Facebook. Whether that will happen in the US is to be seen. But Jen, you have a critique of the whole push for regulation.
No, I mean, I think regulation is important, but it's not going to solve, you know, other underlying structural problems. And I think the other point that you're making is really key, is that because, you know, digital capitalism right now is spread throughout the world, that things can shift and move around despite regulations, which we saw the same situation that Steve talked about earlier in terms of, you know, kind of the race to the lowest wage possible around the world that really took off in the 1980s in the US. But I think if we consider, you know, how any kind of, you know, social regulation for the good of the common collective actually happens is through people organizing, right? And so, yes, I mean, in California was this, you know, very wealthy person who was like, okay, we need to do something about it. On the other hand, there's also kind of a groundswell of support as well. And if we look at, I mean, it's also a question not only across countries, but as Stephen pointed out in the US, and if we just look at a policy perspective, I mean, that's how any major social policy in the US often happens. I mean, there are people who study this and often point to California and Massachusetts as the states that often have the most progressive legislation, and then it can spread. But I think it's really going to take people organizing around the world for that to shift. Not only specific regulations, but even shifting the power of balance more broadly.
Okay, another question.
Thanks to Dorothy, and thanks for having this panel today. I think it's a timely discussion we're having, because the world is on fire. The world is on fire. In fact, for myself, who is a socialist, revolutionary socialist, the idea in the United States that you would have a debate between socialism and capitalism, that would be a national debate, it's unheard of in the United States, to have somebody who calls himself a socialist debating a capitalist candidate, the billionaires. And why is that? Why has that happened in the United States? And one of the reasons we're talking about is what's happening in the economy, what's happening in capitalism. Because there's an important, theory about the development of change and technology. And the main motor force in history is the need for society to develop the productive forces to increase our knowledge and mastery over nature, to reduce socially necessary labor time, need to produce and reproduce the conditions of life, to improve lifestyles, and to improve the standard of living. And the development of technology in the history of humanity, the history of the world, has been the development of technology to increase productivity. The mills in Manchester, the development of technology displaced workers, and there was a movement in England of the Luddites to protect their jobs who were being driven out of their jobs. Industrialization has transformed the United States from a rural economy to an industrialized country. And at the same time, what you have within capitalism is the drive for profits. And that's one of the reasons the United States, with no industrial policy, has this industrial wasteland. The industrial wasteland in the Midwest is a result of capitalism saying we can make more profits by first going to the South, where there are no unions, then going to Mexico and going to China. This is not good or bad, this is the nature of capitalism. That's how capitalism operates. And I think that the development of technology and the internet has been a very important qualitative change for the world and for the working class of the world particularly, on how work is distributed, how there's a division of labor. I remember with Steve when we formed Labornet in 1989, when I first learned about email. What an unbelievable thing. This was before the web. I mean, the idea that email, there are no borders. You can communicate with anybody in the world. You can discuss and debate with people throughout the world. That's a fantastic thing for humanity, for exchange of information, for linking up and learning about the world. So we formed Labornet as a vehicle to educate working people about technology and to use technology in our struggles for the defense of human rights, labor rights on the job, that kind of thing. And of course, initially the capitalists were not that interested in developing the internet. But what took place, as always, is that capitalists and capitalism sees how can you exploit a new technology to make profit. That's what it's about. And the development of this technology was sold to us initially when computers were developed as it was going to free people. Do you remember people, that was what we were told in the beginning when computers were being developed. You'd be free from your daily work. You'd have an opportunity to have more time to develop your life, to do what you wanted to do. That was how computers were sold. And in the reality today is now we're tethered to the computer. Workers, not just in this country, but throughout the world, are tethered to these cell phones. And in fact, in China, the smartphone is called the machine. Why? Because they work on it. That's how they're connected to the world global economy. In fact, I spoke in Istanbul at the Society of Engineers, and I gave a speech about the exploitation and control of Twitter and all these companies, and a guy came up and said, have you given this talk in China? And I said, no, why is that? I work for a Chinese company. So people are working for companies throughout the world, and these companies treat people differently. In the United States, for example, you can complain about how these companies, Google, treat people, but in other countries, it's much worse, where there are no labor protections. For example, in Costa Rica, Facebook and other companies hire the top engineering students at the University of Costa Rica. And they hire them for like 2 or 3 years, and then they lay them off and hire another whole group of students. So the students who are graduated and want to get a job and have a career don't have that possibility in Costa Rica. They don't have the ability in Costa Rica to develop the computer industry because these multinationals basically want to exploit young students, take advantage of them, and then move on for other labor. There's also the technology of micro work. It was sold to us that this is going to help people in Africa and around the world, that you're going to get better jobs and you're going to get computer training and it's going to improve your living standard in life. Well, what's happened is in Africa that you get a little piece of work, micro work, that's your job. It has nothing to do with real computer training and becoming a scientist. It has to do with the corporations' need, these tech companies' needs to exploit your labor with no protection. That's the reality for millions of workers around the world who are in the computer industry and have no control and no protection. So there are some positive things that I want to go about. Now, social media, this tool has transformed not just on a negative way, but a positive way. For example, in the teachers' strike in the United States, in West Virginia and in Tennessee, teachers organize themselves through social media, through Facebook. They put out their material, they've had videos, and what an exciting thing that a teacher can broadcast his ideas, his views, and reach thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of other teachers. The idea that you can use these vehicles to broadcast points of view, your struggles, your issues, Black Lives Matter, other issues, is fantastic. In fact, when people talk about racism and discrimination, the murder of African Americans has been going on for the existence of the United States. It's nothing new. But social media has actually made it live. Every day you can see this going on. That makes it, to people, a way to understand. This isn't an isolated incident. This is systemic racism which has a long history in the United States. Social media has made it possible to see that, people, every day. That is a very positive thing. And that's something that's dangerous at the same time to those people who want to control and sanitize what you are seeing and what you were hearing. And that's why there's a drive to control the internet, to censor the internet, to censor these tools so only some information get out. And Facebook today, for example, if you have articles and information critical of Israel and the policy of the Zionists towards the Palestinians, it's being censored. In fact, professors are being fired because Zionists will put up a anti-Semitic graphic on their Facebook unbeknownst to them, and then they'll be charged with being anti-Semitic. This has happened in Canada. So these tools that we use are also tools that can be used against people. They can be used politically. There's a case in India right now where a activist in computer industry who that's shocking, her name is Gayatri Kanhadai, was supporting human rights for Muslims in India. In her group, It's for All. And what happened is that she was targeted by racialists who are against Muslims, attacking her personally, threatening her life. So these are real issues, real concerns that we have to understand and educate ourselves about, because people's lives are in danger. People's lives are in danger. And this is something that is one of the negative effects of social media. So, and you have, of course, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff, about how everything that we do, as Steve was saying, is being studied. Everything. And in China, if you walk across the street illegally, you can get a ticket, because they have recognition, artificial recognition of people, so it's automatically deducted from your checking account. So the social control of this technology means that people do not have freedom. They're watched all the time. And if they go outside the bounds, you can be punished for that. You can be killed for that. You can be put in jail. This is how it's being used by repressive governments around the world. In Turkey and Egypt, many other governments are using these tools, spying, to go after people. So what is the solution? And from my point of view, and of working people, the only solution really is for working people to take control of this technology. Now, tech workers are organizing. At Google and other companies, and Facebook. At Amazon, I was at a demonstration of the Walmart workers, actually Walmart tech workers. After the massacre in Texas of Mexicans and Mexican Americans at that Walmart, the Walmart workers had a protest here, tech Walmart workers in San Bruno, to demand that Walmart stop selling guns. Now, these workers are not organized in unions, but they said, look, we are at threat. If somebody can go into Walmart and machine gun people because of their nationality, we are at threat. We have to say, stop selling the guns. So they took this action as unorganized workers, and it's pretty brave. Most of them are young people. They're young workers from all over the world in the Bay Area who took that action. So the fact is that technology workers themselves are becoming politicized. I mean, many of the technology workers in the Bay Area are from all over the world, from India, from many other countries, and now they're being targeted. They're being blamed by this government for the problems. Indians and other workers from Turkey. So there's a backlash against that, where these tech workers who are contributing to our society, into the world, themselves are becoming targeted because the increase of racialism, the increase of xenophobia and nationalism. Well, why are these things happening? The reason is we have a class society, and the economic crisis is making people very angry about what's happening to them. For the last 30 or 40 years, the real income of people has declined in the United States. People are looking for solutions. That's one of the reasons Trump is president of the United States. People are very angry about what's happening. So we need to use this technology, and my view is that working people have to control the technology. These platforms like Uber should be controlled by the workers to benefit the workers. That's who should really run these techs, not for the exploitation of the working class by billionaires who run San Francisco and run the world. How is that going to happen? That will happen by, one, education. We have to educate ourselves about these tools and technologies. Two, by using these tools to organize ourselves, to defend ourselves against repression, against racism, against the attacks on workers and in unions, on teachers, on public education, which is being destroyed in San Francisco and around the country, closing public schools while opening charter schools. I mean, this is going on right here in San Francisco, the destruction of community college, San Francisco Community College. In a city of billionaires, why are they laying off teachers in San Francisco? Question. Why are teachers being laid off in San Francisco? They say they can't afford them? Is that really true? When you have more billionaires per person in San Francisco than any other city in the United States? This disparity of wealth is part of what's happened with capitalism, and why there's a revolt, really, of people in this country against this system. It's really a system issue. And I think that the technology, like every other part of our society, is part of the tools and that are there that can be either used to oppress people or people can use those tools. Now, we don't have a mass movement in the United States, but we are going to have one. And the people that run this country are afraid of what happened in the 60s because they're afraid of millions of people going on the streets. But it is coming in this country. And when it comes, I think that they will not be able to control these tools. Because if you have millions of people organizing, you cannot control these tools. And to shut down the internet, and this is another contradiction, to shut down the internet means shutting down the world. That's what that means. The whole world is integrated into the internet, into communication. So if you shut it down to control it, you close the world down. And one thing the capitalists do not want is to shut down their businesses. They don't want to shut, because that's money. That makes them profit, and that threatens their ability to rule. But that is really the agenda that we're coming towards. The crisis now today with the stock market, this crisis of healthcare, coronavirus, is another reflection of technology, because even though we have the technology to understand diseases, we're not spending money on public health. They're closing public health centers. How could that be? When you need to have these technologies, at the same time, there's no protection in the tech industry, biotech, for what is being produced there. There's no health and safety. The companies are regulating themselves. So you're introducing technology, in this case biotechnology, and there's no regulation on how it's being used, what it's being used for, and the protection of the workers that are developing this technology, this biotech. That, again, is another example of technology out of control. So I think we have many issues to confront, but actually I'm optimistic. I think people can seize the time, people can educate themselves, and that's what we have to work towards. So thank you very much.
We can, better teach, younger kids especially how to use social media and, what is actually, what they're actually, becoming a part of, especially like younger kids who are all on YouTube and Instagram all the time. This is really affecting. How can we teach these, younger individuals how to better use social media? Because it doesn't really seem like it's coming at any levels of education within the United States.
Well, just to give a plug out to Emily, she's doing a workshop next Tuesday called How Youth Transform Gendered and Sexual Narratives Online. So I always get it from you guys that it's always the people younger than you. But you might want to go to this and talk about what you do and other ways that you can help one another. Right, Emily, is that it?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Sorry, tell me about that, but hey, Emma.
I mean, I'll just make one comment. Yeah, I mean, I think that I would generally agree with that, but I think there are pockets of either teachers or school districts around at least the U.S. and around the world as well, where there is some really good, positive, grassroots digital literacy happening that really address these issues. But I agree with you overall, especially with the introduction of digital devices in schools paid for by these corporations that are now undergoing mass surveillance of students at the same time. We cannot rely on schools overall, or definitely not these tech companies to provide that type of digital literacy. And not to sound like a broken record, but again, I think it is going to take more grassroots effort to really to institutionalize that, because I don't think we can rely on just individual pockets. It has to be more widespread. And as someone who lives in France, where the educational system is nationalized, when there is a problem such as this and a challenge, there's just more digital literacy that can be spread more quickly. And it's really challenging in a country like this, where you have every individual, not even every county, but every city often has a different school board, right? And I think it's not just kids, it's adults too, right? I think we're all constantly needing this digital literacy. It's so hard to keep up with everything. And I think that that's one of the things I found in my research is that, initially when people were looking at the digital divide, it was a very binary, do you have access to the internet or not, right? And then we've reached, in the US and other developed countries, 90%, which is not good enough. There's still 10% of the population that does not have regular, consistent access, so that's a problem. But nonetheless, the people that are online, the other factor is skills, right? So really having, and understanding these skills, and there are a variety of other factors that feed into digital inequality, but, you know, it, unlike other ways in which we can, you know, adopt technologies, whether it was like a telephone or the television, where, you know, there was basically, you know, yes, there were slightly different types of TVs or phones, but digital technology is changing all the time. So even if poor and marginalized folks, you know, okay, they get access to the internet, or maybe they have a mobile phone, or maybe a laptop, there's always something else. There's always something breaking down, or these tech companies are always introducing these new surveillance tools that both Steve and Stephen pointed out. And it's, I think meeting that challenge is one of the most crucial, how to keep up, because it's a treadmill. Even, you know, among people who have education, who have resources to really keep up and to resist the mass, you know, surveillance. But at the same time, I would slightly disagree with Steve about all of us being tethered to our gadgets. I mean, I am, you know, it's so hard to not, especially studying digital technology and then getting sucked up into all these algorithms that you pointed out, right? They want you. But that for a lot of folks who have jobs where you have to hand in your cell phone when you clock into work and then have to drive long hours or on the transportation, and maybe your data plan, you can't afford it 1 month and you get another one, et cetera, that this whole concept of time sometimes is turned on its head for more marginalized communities. So then that adds an either extra barrier of people who don't have that regular, consistent access to also, on top of that, engage with digital literacy. So sorry to be such a downer there, but maybe some of you have some more positive.
I mean, I think young people like the youth movement against guns, murders. Well, that was an example of young people organizing and using their tools and educating themselves about an issue. The same can take place about these social media tools, what they're doing and how they're tracking young people, how they're used to bully young people. I mean, in the schools, this is a very serious issue. Kids are being bullied using these social media tools. So there has to be an organized, I agree it has to be institutional, media programs, media education programs as part of a structure. How is this media being used? How can people protect themselves? What is it doing to people? Because it's like, you know, the scanner machines. People know about scanner machines, which now Amazon wants to get rid of all clerks and just put in scanners. But when scanner machines first came in, this was a great tool for people to get your stuff. But the workers who were, you know, doing these machines were not told that you could get carpal tunnel syndrome.
You mean in grocery stores? Grocery
stores, yeah. And what happened was, in Sweden, they have more protection as far as the introduction of new technology. So before you can install a scanner machine that's going to affect workers and how they do their work, you have to test it, how it's going to affect people. Right. Here, go for it. Go for it. There's no control. So as a result of that, in the United States, millions of mostly women workers got carpal tunnel syndrome. And I interviewed them and covered them. But their lives were destroyed as a result of their wrist getting carpal tunnel syndrome. No protection. Why? Because the corporations want to make money and they don't want regulation. So there's no regulation, and people had to fight for regulation. Women clerks who I interviewed were told they were just take some aspirin. It's all in your head that you're getting these problems with your wrists. So this is a problem with technology and the introduction of technology. If there's no control over it, if there's no investigation of how it affects people, you have a problem. Because people can be harmed permanently, their lives can be destroyed, and they have been destroyed. And there's no accountability. Where is the accountability of these companies? Well, there isn't any. I mean, they do things and they get away with it, and if they're fined, that's the most. They never go to prison for introducing technology that actually harms people.
Steve, you had something?
Yeah, I mean,
There's, you know, different places are doing different things. So in Europe, for example, they use more of what's called a precautionary principle. Before you can introduce something new, technology or what have you, you have to sort of demonstrate that it's not going to be harmful. We have that in the US where it comes to like medical devices. You can't just put something into someone's chest and not show that it's not going to kill them. And you have to show that, you know, it's going to work the same way 3 months from now, 3 years from now as it works today. So these are just kind of, in some ways, common sense things that we in the U.S. need to do more of. Other places already are doing more of, so we can learn from them. But I think to shift the conversation a little bit, I think you have to really think about what these devices are doing to our brains. These are new in terms of human evolution, and we really haven't had enough time to really study them. When you turn this thing on and you flip into an app, you have to think that there are basically about 1,000 engineers behind that app that have tried to figure out who you are, and they have tried to target you with what they want you to do on their app. That's what's going on with that app. And so, for adults, if we can educate people, they can make some good decisions. But for teenagers and for kids who are using these things, I would say these are dangerous devices for them. There's educational potential if they're used correctly, but if not, they actually can cause problems. For example, the race for likes and follows among teens where they're trying to be popular, it causes a lot of anxiety among teenagers. The rates of teen depression and suicide are way up since the start of the social media era. Because there's so much pressure now with these devices and who's got them and what they're doing with them and who's popular and how many likes do you have and all these sorts of things. I mean, to talk about what other places are doing, China, not that it's a great example for a lot of things, but China actually has limited the number of hours that young people 16 and under can use their smartphones. You can only use it no more than 2 hours a day and no more than 3 hours on the weekend. The leaders of Silicon Valley, if you ask them, do your children use social media? They say, oh, no, absolutely not. I don't give my kids a smartphone until they're 16, 17, 18. These are the people who are making this stuff. But they know what it is. They know what they're doing. They know how they've used different design techniques, how they've used psychological, the psychological architecture of our brains in order to design their apps and then to get the data from us that we're willingly giving up to them for free in order to, they basically have created for each one of you a biographical profile. They know who you are. They know who you are more than your therapist knows who you are. They know what you do at 2 a.m. in the morning on your phone. They know what you watch and for how long. They know all of this information about you. They know where you go. Every app on your phone is tracking you. They know you're here right now. Is this really the way we want this stuff to work? I mean, there's this term out there, surveillance capitalism. It is surveillance. It's way beyond even surveillance because they're using this information to persuade you, to manipulate you. This is more powerful than anything the Stasi or the Nazis or any type of state-run espionage organization ever created. And we are just letting them do it for nothing. Now, keep in mind, these companies started out as small. So when they first said, look, we're going to give you away these great services, I mean, no question. Google Maps is great. A search on the internet is great. These are great things. So when they said, we're going to give these away for free, everyone was like, wow, that's pretty cool. I've never heard of a capitalist company that did that. But no one realized that in taking our data, they were going to create this entire ecosystem that they have created. So the trick here is how do we keep these good things that they've created? It's like they've created a new infrastructure for the digital age. And we can look back through U.S. history. We can see other times where they've created new infrastructure, where it's telecommunications, power, and electricity. AT&T, you all know who AT&T is. Well, it used to be the biggest phone company in the world. At one point in the 1980s, AT&T had 97% penetration. So 97% of people who had a telephone were on AT&T. It was a monopoly. They were manipulating it. They were doing all these things. So they broke up AT&T into a bunch of smaller companies, 5 smaller companies. And so these are the types of things that we can do. Just because Facebook and Google and Amazon, we haven't even talked about that, how Amazon manipulates their platform to hurt you, the consumer, to hurt a bunch of other businesses. It's like they are the shopping mall, and they own a bunch of shops in the shopping mall. And they go to the other shops in the mall and they shake them down to get better deals because they have all the data of what all of us are buying. They know which products are trending, which ones are popular. They can use that data to manipulate all the other vendors selling in the shopping mall. We have to decide the rules that they have created on their own, without any intervention, because they started small and we said, oh, these are new technologies, let's not put regulation around them, let's let them innovate, let's see what happens. Now we know what happened. And so we have to put the right rules around them to keep the good and to minimize the bad. That's where we are right now. And so for those of you making videos of things, there are ways, you know how to make videos, using cartoons and everything. We have to make this information accessible to everybody so that they understand when you turn on that smartphone, there's a lot happening behind the scenes that people are not aware of. We have to do a massive education about this, and as you are learning, really cool, sophisticated communication tools, you have a big role to play in this. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, Ali.
I was just gonna say there's like a trend that's been happening recently of like young men being radicalized online, and I want to know if you guys think that's gonna increase or decrease as time goes on.
It's going to increase.
Are you talking about?
Like incels and,
What,
Like
incel?
all that, yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
Like people like.
Yeah, there actually has been a study recently.
Doing stuff,
There's been a study recently showing they classified, men who were with this mentality in 4 different categories, each one more extreme. And they show that the ones that are less extreme are getting smaller, and the ones that are more extreme are getting bigger. And some of the men who were less extreme, because of online media, because they're getting more and more extreme information, some of it fake news, some of it made up stuff, they are becoming more extreme. And that's happening in immigration. There was just recently a situation, the magazine Der Spiegel in Germany, which is one of the main German publications, they uncovered a story in which about a woman whose sister had been murdered by an immigrant in Germany. And so there was an entire family there, the parents who were mourning the loss of their daughter, the sister mourning the loss of her daughter, a brother mourning the loss of her daughter. They had entire biographies of who these people are, about the immigrant that murdered her. It was completely made up. The family didn't exist. The murder didn't exist. The immigrant didn't exist. None of it existed. And yet it was out there being liked, shared, all these sorts of things. That's what's going on. We're going to see a lot of that in this upcoming presidential election. So we have to, really, we can play a role, all of us, in talking to people, family members, and who maybe are, tilt one way or the other. Say, are you sure that's real news? You sure that's not fake news? How do you know? What's the source of it? You should really try to get behind it. So this is the world we're moving into, and where all of you who know about media, you know about technology and how it works. So educate yourselves, educate the people around you, make new products that are better than that help us to educate people. This is the challenge we have going forward. Did I answer that question? Maybe I got off on a little bit of a rant there.
Does everybody know what incel is?
I just make a quick point.
Wait a minute, maybe just describe it fast, because I'm sure this.
It stands for involuntary celibate. It's men who are angry at women because they can't get sex, and so they blame women for it, for not basically giving it up, and just like they have this warped view that somehow if only women knew how great I am, I'd be, Hugh Hefner or something. Or
so rather than make an effort to talk to women, they're online talking
to other men, complaining about women who won't talk to them. Yeah.
So I'm going to...
This is what I said. This is Crazy Town. There's a name for it. It's called Crazy Town. That's where we're heading in so many ways.
So I'm going to take a slightly different take that, as a social scientist, I'm very interested in claims being made about the effects of technology. So I don't know if in this class you've talked about this idea of technological determinism, right? So how much is technology the actual or only or main driving agent to affect something, right? It's the cause of something. And no one really says it's only technology. There are often other broader contexts, but I think those broader contexts are often, as a sociologist, we often forget, and we focus so much on that technology. So as a scholar, I'm very interested in how, when people talk about, for example, Twitter or Facebook revolutions, how much of it is the actual tool and how much of it is the broader structural reasons why people came together. People have always used communication tools for social movements on both the left and the right. In this country, the KKK, 100 years ago, was this mass civic organization all over the country, right? And it was recruiting people right and left. And not just in the US South. Indiana had, I think, the highest percentage of people in the KKK, right? So this is not new. And I'm not saying that technology doesn't play an important role, and it often makes this communication more efficient. But if we just blame technology, I think like what's happening right now, we're having a moral panic over disinformation, right? Yes, conservatives, like I found, are more likely to share and link to fake news, but it's a small part of their overall news diet. And again, I think we should do things to regulate it, but we also have to think of the broader reasons. Why are people even attracted to this, right? What kind of alienation is happening? What's happening, more broadly in terms of inequality or other structural reasons? And there are a lot of great scholars that have researched other movements like the KKK. McVeigh has a really good way in which he talks about that, whiteness in general, white people, whether it was 100 years ago or during the civil rights movement, react because of they're feeling like their power is devalued, right? And so that's a core piece of looking at racism, not to justify it by any means at all. But I think if we rely on the technology as both the cause and the effect of what's happening, we're going to really miss the broader idea. And just one more example. So a colleague of mine at UC Berkeley, Dylan Riley, he published this book. He does historical sociology, and he looked at the countries in Europe a century ago that became fascist and those that didn't. And rather than the countries that became fascist being the ones where there was not much happening in civil society and that people, fascist leaders just came in and filled that vacuum, that it was the countries that had the strongest civil society, right? A lot of grassroots organizations. So I think we really have to think about especially what's happening among conservatives and their organizing, and they're not just dupes, right? So another theory, I don't know if you've talked about in this class, is in terms of media effects, theory that's been debunked, decades ago about the injection model of information, right? So
You have another class, it's not in this one.
Yeah. So basically it was this idea that, people are injected with information and are just robots following whatever information they receive, right? And so that theory has been debunked. But it's interesting, we've almost come back to that idea with this panic around disinformation. And sounds like you really want to say something, but I think we need to just think more broadly about what else is happening and see the agency, because a lot of the people that I studied, a lot of the leaders of these far-right groups, they're not stupid. A lot of them one leader of one Tea Party had a master's in special education, another had a PhD in physics, right? A lot of these activists are not just reading this so-called fake news, and we need to think about why that is.
I think I just want to give a call out to your book, because as we were discussing on Tuesday, you really lay that out. The technology can't be separate. It's not a separate domain. It sits on top of a system that's brutally, violently unequal. It reproduces those inequalities. In some ways it maximizes it, and it monetizes them, right? That's the important part that you've all said. And the other thing, just to for those of us to follow up on, and we'll see this more in this year, is that it's funded by people who've not just made money out of digital capitalism, but other kinds of capitalism. So the Koch brothers make money out of the fossil fuel industry. And the reason why I'm pointing that out is because they've systematically funded a conservative drive to take over the electoral system for the last 50 years. And where did that come from? Response to people organizing in the 60s. So I want to ask you, where are there examples in San Francisco or California of how people are organizing, either for reform, and I'm thinking or for changing the conditions, these kinds of structural things that relate to technology? If I can ask each of you to talk about that.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, there's a tech workers coalition that it's organizing tech workers are not organized. Most workers in this country are not in unions, first of all. And tech workers themselves are not in unions. And one of the reasons is workers, if they try to form unions, are fired, even though it's illegal. If you talk about a union in a work situation, in a non-union work situation, the likelihood is you're going to get fired. So that's a terrorism against workers in this country. You don't have freedom on the job in this country. If you speak up, you're fired if you have no union protection. So tech workers are beginning to organize. So there's some organizing struggles, but it's very difficult. These companies, they just fired some people at Google who were organizing. And, you know, they try to go through the court, but the court system is controlled by the same people who run these companies. It's a rigged system. But I would say that as far as radicalism, you know, there's a reason for radicalism. Let's talk about it. The United States has destroyed Iraq. The United States has destroyed Libya. People's lives have been destroyed. Millions of people have been forced to go into migration and forced to go to Europe. People don't want to travel, leave their homes from Mexico and Central America, but when their country is destroyed, they have to escape. And they come to Europe or they come to the United States, and then the same people who created the wars blame them, say that they're responsible. Immigrants are responsible for this crisis. The xenophobia and racism is fed by racist and right-wing organizations that are funded by billionaires, the Mercer family. The people that are supporting Trump have supported wars. They defend wars. In fact, their view is that the oil in Iraq belongs to the United States. Doesn't belong to the Iraqi people. So this has created a condition whereby people look for, you know, how to fight back. And theocratic organizations, religious organizations, all kinds of organizations use that to organize, and they use these social media tools. So the problem is, why are people angry? Why are people angry in the United States? Why do people support Trump? Why are people supporting Sanders? It's because of the social conditions that are arising in this country, and they're growing deeper. That is the whole point. It's not going away, and that's, I think, as far as technology and social media, we have to understand why these things are happening. What are the conditions behind them? There are organizations that are trying to organize workers, but it's very difficult. And actually, there's been a growth of unionism. Young people are getting, in the brewery workers, Anchor Steam workers are organizing. Tardine workers are getting organized, and they're using social tools to organize. So that's a great thing. I mean, as far as using these social media tools to help get your solidarity out and educate people about why they should be supported. I don't know if that's...
You started to get to it. I also
Maybe I'm
want to
talking
ask you
about
about
AB5.
AB5.
Yeah. So there's a bill that just became law January 1st. It's known as AB5,
We'll
and
talk about it on Tuesday, but it would be great to hear.
yeah, and the others who weren't in the class, it sounds
Yeah,
like.
there's other people who aren't.
So AB5, you know, so for a few decades, the U.S. economy has been drifting a certain direction where more and more workers are being hired as contractors and freelancers and not as regularly employed people. And as a contractor and freelancer, you don't have any job safety. You know, they can get rid of you just like that. There's no health benefits or any kind of safety net for you or anything like this. And so, you know, when the amount of people working this way was small, it sort of worked okay with the economy. It allowed people to get work and to get experience and get moving. And in fact, the whole system came about from the 1950s where it was called Kelly's Girls. They wanted to just hire women, and the rap was like, oh, they're just women. You know, we're just going to hire them for a few hours a week. It's not a big deal. Let's not worry about the fact that they don't have a real labor contract behind them. And so it started in that sort of way, and then just kept growing in the 50s and 60s, and then it started including men, 70s, 80s, 90s, and now when you have, as I said, platforms like Upwork where you can get online and hire a freelancer all over the world, it's just kind of blown open labor conditions that really threatens jobs. So California passed a law that went into effect on January 1st called AB5, in which it took a lot of these classifications, types of occupations that were freelance, and said, they created a test, a three-pronged test that said if your workers don't pass this three-pronged test, they are considered regular employees, not freelancers, and you must hire them as regular employees. And so this, of course, was, it's probably the biggest labor legislation passed in the United States in 30 years. It happened here in California, and now other states are looking to copy that. Now there's some people worried about, well, as a freelancer, maybe they won't hire me anymore. Maybe I'm going to lose my capacity. And so there's going to be some shakeout as the impact of this filters throughout the economy. There's no question there's going to be fewer freelancers, but there's going to be more people hired as a regularly employed worker. And the reality is that the freelance life, I've been a freelancer for many years myself, it's not all that it's cracked up to be. They'll tell you things like, oh, you're the CEO of your own business. You're your own boss. You can work when you want. Oh, the flexibility is great. Yeah, the flexibility is great if you're earning enough income. If you're not earning enough income, you're working all the time. And not only are you working all the time, but you're looking for the next job all the time, and you're not getting paid for that, okay? And you don't have health care, you don't have benefits. So I think on whole, AB 5 is going to be very good for California and for the United States. But for those who have been working as freelancers, some people are going to be complaining about how it's going to change what they do. But I think it's a good sign that a government somewhere in the U.S. was reversing this 50-year trend of going to more and more freelancers and saying, hold on, we've been doing this for a long time now. As Steve said earlier, the average wage in the United States has not gone up in 30 years, even as profits on these big companies has gone up and up and up. They're not, the amount of money that goes into the pockets of the corporations and of wealthier people, these are well-known, well-studied phenomena, is more and more, and the amount going to middle-class people and lower-income people is less and less. So part of this is because so many people are freelancers. As freelancers, you don't even have a right to organize a union. You cannot organize in a union if you're a freelancer. It's also because if you're a freelancer, it's hard to organize them into labor unions. So the amount of labor unions, used to be a third of the people in the United States worked in a job that had a labor union representing them. At this point, it's 7%. So these trends have not been good for people like all of us in this room. And AB 5 is a step in the right direction, even if it has some issues that are going to have to be fixed over the next few years. So that's one example of some. And other things are, I mentioned this portable safety net idea. For those who still remain as freelancers, it doesn't make any sense at all that just because you're a freelancer, that employer that hires you shouldn't contribute money beyond your wage for your safety net needs, so you can have health care. And we structure the economy in a way that you, the worker, are covered regardless of whether you have a regular employed job or you are a freelancer. And also, for a while there in the workplace, they were doing a lot of surveillance. When you type on a keyboard, they can track you. When you use your mouse, they can track you. And so more and more, they're starting to pass laws saying, no, you can't do this kind of surveillance in the workplace. So there's a lot of positive things going on as we react to the technological changes that have been occurring. And I think for you as, potentially younger freelancers, videographers, to be honest, the life of a freelancer for most freelancers is not an easy one. There is an organization called the Freelancers Union. If you're not aware of them, you should check them out. They do try to get people networking. They have regular meetings here where you can network with other freelancers and, sort of swap trade secrets and that kind of thing, and that's all good. But the move towards having more regularly employed videographer jobs at a university. A lot of universities started using freelancers instead of hiring regular videographers and regular other occupations. Even some of your professors are what's called adjunct professors. They're basically freelancers, and some of them have to work at several different universities to put together enough income to make it work. This is just not a good trend in whether it's academic, in universities, in private sector, in the public sector. It's just not a good trend, and it hasn't worked out well for American society. So there are now pushback going in the other direction, but we have a ways to go.
Are you going to give us more examples? Otherwise, I'm going to open it up.
Okay, yeah, I was just going to say, the tech companies are going to spend, I think, $90 million to 30 million to overturn this AB 5, and that's going to create a fight, a struggle over this bill. So actually, for videographers, it's an opportunity to talk about the life of freelancers. I'm in a freelancers unit of the CWA, Pacific Media Workers Guild, but it's very difficult to survive as a freelancer. So this debate that's going to happen in California is going to be an opportunity to discuss what are the effects of freelancing, the gig economy. Why shouldn't workers be protected to have health care, to have Social Security when they work, whatever work they're doing? Shouldn't all workers have health care, Social Security benefits as a basic human right?
And it's easy to do. I mean, we can design a system that does it easy. In fact, right here in San Francisco, I'm talking with members of the Board of Supervisors about passing a law in San Francisco where we'll do it here first, because we haven't done this in the United States before. Other countries are doing things like this already. We can learn from them, we can do it better than them, and we can start right here in San Francisco. So you may see a bill introduced over the next few months in San Francisco to create this portable safety net for freelancers like yourselves, videographers, artists, what have you. I mean, in Germany they have and in France too, they have a system where musicians, artists, and others, they you pay a certain amount for health care, and the government pays the other half, the employer's half. Because usually the way you structure these things is like you as a worker, you pay part of your healthcare expenses and the employer pays part of it. And so other countries are already experimenting with other models about how we can make it so that freelancers have the coverage that you need in order to have a good life and enjoy your life and also do the types of work that you're passionate about. This is all doable.
Okay, other questions? Yeah.
So what would you say to someone that says that because you choose to sign up for these apps and use all these social media, you are willingly giving up your right and you kind of deserve to get your information taken?
Well, I would just say briefly, the thing to watch is have you ever had the experience where you go on YouTube and suddenly you're wow, where'd the last 2 hours go? Wow, I just kept watching video after video after video. I've certainly had that experience. I mean, I watch all these old rock and rollers from the 60s and 70s. It's wow, another one of the Beatles. This is one of the Rolling Stones. There's Crosby, Stills, Nash. And I just keep watching holy moly, this is amazing. And then 2 hours is gone. I wish I had those 2 hours back, even though that was kind of fun. If you're having that experience a lot, you just need to turn that phone off. And go outside and go talk to some friends, go hang out with some friends, and don't, forget liking everything, forget following everything. This kind of stuff, it was interesting that they came up with this model. It was an interesting model. It turns out it's destructive, and we have to change it. And that's what a lot of people are talking about right now.
It's addiction.
It's addictive, yeah.
And I think, it's what's happening in education now is that these same billionaires like Reed Hastings, who owns Netflix and supports charter schools, these tech billionaires, the Facebook Foundation, they're pushing computers in schools for young children. Now, do you want young children to be in front of screens when they're 5, 6, 7 years old? Is that healthy? Well, the fact is they're not even OSHA standards, health and safety standards for children, when your mind is developing as a child on the effect of computers, looking at a computer screen all the time.
Right.
I mean, think about that, the danger of that.
To piggyback on that, Steve, so there are all sorts of laws around Saturday morning cartoons for children about violence and advertisement and all these sorts of things that don't apply to watching on YouTube. I mean, Google is feeling pressure about it, so they're starting to try and tweak that a little bit. But so basically the laws we pass for all these traditional brick and mortar companies, the online companies are not following many of them. So it's just online, lawlessness. So in some ways, our challenge is just to take the laws we already have and apply them to the companies so that, for example, Ford Motor Company, if they wanted to come to San Francisco and set up an auto plant and just start cranking out cars, right? It has to engage in negotiations with the government. It has to, sign up to licenses and permits and rules about what you can and can't do. In fact, Volkswagen, the German company, there are executives sitting in jail right now because they tried to cheat on auto emissions with their changing the software to cheat on auto emissions tests. They're in jail. That's what we developed for traditional brick and mortar companies. You could fine them. You could even shut them down. You could jail their CEOs if they break the law. With these online companies, they kind of exist everywhere and nowhere. And so a lot of the rules and laws we've created aren't being applied. And so, part of our challenge is, for example, here in California, we're talking about passing a law which will create for Facebook and these other companies a digital license. And it will say, if you want to operate here in California, here are the rules you must conform to in terms of what you do with your advertising, recommendations, micro-targeting, amplification, all these sorts of things that they've developed. No, we're going to change that for you, Facebook. You're now going to do them a different way. And if you don't do them the way that the law says, you will be in a lot of trouble. And so these are the types of things that, creating digital licenses for these digital companies, recognizing this is the new infrastructure for the 21st century. So what rules do we want around this infrastructure? That's where we are going with this. And that's where all of you, the more you can get involved in it and start educating yourselves about it, it's going to be great, because we're going to make these companies work the way we want them to work, not the way they have created. And to give you another example of how bad this can get if we're not careful, the Philippines. Facebook went into the Philippines and said, we will give free internet to everybody, which they don't do here, right? We pay for our internet. But in the Philippines, they said, we'll pay for your internet. And the way people get on the internet is through Facebook. Facebook has 97% penetration in the Philippines. So a fellow came along by the name of Roberto Duterte, and said, you know what, we can use this. He's basically has this, he's the president now, he's a quasi-dictator. So we can use this to our advantage. So what they started doing is using Facebook to create a lot of fake news. They created all these fake news stories about drugs and all the drug dealers. And his prime opponent was a woman in the legislature. They made a fake news video about her, showing her having sex with another person. It was completely a deep fake. And they did all these things to attack her and to go after her. And so and then they target. They say, okay, which people are going to be susceptible to this message? Some people reject it entirely, of course. But they put their information in these information filters in which they're targeting older people, people who are more conservative, people who have children. They're the ones that are going to be concerned about drugs. And so they start there, and they start hyping it and putting out fake news and getting those people excited. Hey, have you heard about that story about so-and-so? Apparently they're a drug dealer. And by doing this, they slowly get the population all whipped up into hysteria. In other words, the same platform that we are using for our kids' photos, our dog photos, to connect with people, connect with our old friends, they are using for these other methods, for these other purposes, the same exact platform. There was a recent series in New York Times where Facebook and also Zoom, if you've ever used Zoom for meetings, they're using it for live streaming child sexual abuse in real time, where children are being abused and others are watching it and shouting out encouragement. Hey, do this, do that, do this, do that. Mass killers in Christchurch, New Zealand, as he went in and shot up a Muslim place, he was live streaming it. This is what these platforms have become. We cannot allow this. This is going to destroy our democracies. So we have to figure out the way to rein this in a way that, again, there's good things that come from these platforms. People have used them in good ways, but they're being slowly twisted in these very strange and perverted ways.
So I'm going to end there, and I'm going to say we have a few minutes more. You can come and talk to people individually. You're hanging around for about 10 minutes or so.
Sure.
I want to say this, though, that all of the things that used to regulate the analog industry didn't come without people organizing.
Exactly.
There is a lot of information about how that happened. We need to teach ourselves about some of the lessons of how people organized in the past. One of the things that's really, really important, and we mentioned the other day, but I'm going to say it again, 1996, when the Democratic Party privatized the internet under Clinton and Gore, they made it possible for what has become the overlords, the Amazons and the internet platforms, Facebook and Google, to get away with saying we don't have any responsibility because we are not media platforms.
Right.
We are just retailers of information.
Right.
So one of the things that Steve is alluding to, I'm guessing, is
Section 230 of the Communication Decency Act, 1996.
So we have to go back and repeal that. We also have to use the language that used to be used, and we've talked a little bit about radio, which is, it's a utility. It's for all of us. It's a public good. It benefits all of us, and we need to have it regulated. And I just want to underscore that because I know that that was underneath what you were saying. There's a lot of other steps that people are taking, and we're going to talk about them. Tuesday we're going to find out how you guys are actually doing this on the net. And Thursday, we're going to go back here and talk about some of the ways that people are organizing. So thank you
And check out the Center for Humane Technology.
Okay, well,
the website for that.
We can just write that on the board.
Because we're starting to do a lot of things around these areas, and we're going to need volunteers. We may need videographers for some of the short explainer videos we want to make, so.
Do you have internships?
We're looking to set that up.
Okay.
Yeah, because I'd love to have some of you plug into it. It'd be fabulous.
So thank you very much.
Thank you.